Rachel Kleinfeld, welcome to the Fireside Chat.
Happy to be here.
Now, are young men actually moving right, or does it just seem that way because young women are moving left?
It's a little bit of both. Young women are moving left at a very rapid pace, and they're moving quite left. Young men are a mix. A lot of them are basically shuffling a little bit actually to the left. They're not actually moving right, but because young women are moving so far, they're moving a little. But some are moving to the right. In America, we're seeing a particular movement among Black and Hispanic men who are young, who had never been on the right before, moving toward the right.
And in your view, why is this all happening?
Well, there's a lot of explanations for why men might be doing this kind of voting with their gender identity in mind. One is, of course, that women have gained a lot of power over the last few decades in consolidated democracies. And when men feel under threat from women, they might be voting in a backlash sort of a manner. Another theory is that men are feeling kind of threatened in the cultural sphere, not just power, but sort of more generally speaking. And they're trying to reassert a kind of patriarchal sense that they hold some kind of control. It's not just about gender relations. I should say when people lose a sense of agency, when they lose a sense of control over their lives more broadly, they can assert that in the political sense of things. And so they might be asserting that through voting because they're losing control because of AI and more general technological and other changes. We also think that some men are losing out educationally and in the sort of ability to compete in the working world and the economic world, and might be taking that out politically on women.
So, Rachel, is this really then a move to the right, or is this a move to backlash and counterculture?
Well, it's a little hard to distinguish between the far right, and what I was saying was that men are voting for extreme right parties from this kind of counterculture. There is now a counterculture on the extreme right that is pushing for trad wives and really quite misogynistic ideas, violent misogyny. It had once been that these cultural movements of backlash against women, things like the incel, the involuntarily celibate movement, or trad wives, the desire for a kind of male dominant world, were quite separate from the political sphere. But the extreme right, not just conservatives, but really extreme right parties, have started to reach out to men in these places online and so on and recruit them, so that there's now been a confluence of extreme right political parties and these cultural backlash ideas on gender. And it's pretty hard at this point to distinguish them. There's also, of course, the role of Russia, China, and other foreign actors who are basically trying to spread dissension in democracies any way they can. And so they're looking for all the fissure lines: anti-Semitism, anti-different kinds of minorities, and women versus men is a very clear way to spread that kind of dissension in established democracies.
Now, Trump's not your average right winger, so is Trumpism more or less attractive to young men than standard conservatism is?
Oh, Trump is far more attractive to young men than standard conservatism. You can see that in the polls where young men had been moving left, not nearly as fast as women, and then they started to move very just a little tiny bit left. But the youngest cohort, the kind of high schoolers, 18 years old and so on, will move toward Trump, move to the right. There's something about his particular form of masculinity that seems to be appealing. And he's also doing that very actively, going on these somewhat misogynistic, very male-oriented manosphere shows and really pitching himself. There's a tough dude kind of political commercial that was just made. It was for Harris, but it was a tough, strong guy kind of coming out and trying to say that Trump is playing a strong guy on TV. He isn't really one, and trying to use this image of masculinity and call the bluff on Trump, because it's so clear that his campaign is trying to attract young men and having some success.
Now, you said how Trump's turning up on men's podcasts as a means of attracting this demographic, but is there anything that Kamala Harris has done during this election campaign that might have made Trump seem particularly favourable to young men?
Um, Harris is a very successful woman, and a lot of men are not very comfortable with extremely successful women. She's played in a men's world most of her life, not just the political sphere, but as a prosecutor. That also can be discombobulating to some men who feel less secure in their status. She's really trying, I think, with her husband, who is a tremendously successful attorney and is now supporting her, with her running mate, who is a tremendously successful politician and high school teacher and football coach and embodies this Midwestern masculinity, to showcase a different kind of more old-fashioned masculinity when you were secure enough in your masculinity as a guy that you didn't have to have this performative, over-the-top kind of strength and misogyny. And by trying to bring that back, it's also threatening to these young men who don't have that, who don't know how to fix a car, fix their gutters, do the kinds of traditional male activities, but they can talk online.
Now, Rachel, people on the left might not like men moving to the right very much, but maybe the political ramifications of this are the least of the issues. Are there any other tendencies from these same young men that are more problematic for society, or is this just a voting thing?
Well, I think there are many reasons to really worry when the genders start coming as far apart, not only in who they vote for, but in what that means, what those votes mean. Because, of course, women are facing a real backlash in the United States against abortion. They're also facing a sense of real violent misogyny, not just in the United States, but worldwide. We're seeing a real violent resurgence against female politicians and other female leaders in public life, largely in established democracies. But of course, you can go to Afghanistan where it's just horrific. That's really taking women back into pre-medieval times. So this backlash is really quite threatening to women's gains over the years, but it's also threatening to home life. It's very hard to maintain a strong family if your men and women have such different ideas about what their gender roles should be within that family and what they can expect. And so particularly for young men and young women who are starting out and who are cisgender or straight, they're looking for a partner who shares their beliefs. And as those beliefs diverge more and more, it'll affect family life and the children that come from those families.
Now, Rachel, something we've covered many times on this show are these so-called missing men that have been dropping out of the labour force for decades now, like 50 years. I don't know what exactly they do, to be honest, but is this somehow related to them?
It's hard to say whether the voting patterns are directly related because a lot of those people don't vote. They're really dropping out of everything. They don't show up in clubs. They don't go to events. They don't have groups that they belong to. They're not in religious institutions. They don't vote and they don't work, as you say, and they're not in school. As you say, we really don't know what they're doing. Maybe sitting in the basement playing video games. It's affecting an awful lot of men. Now, whether it's affecting their voting behavior is unknown because a lot of them don't vote, but whether it's affecting the culture for men to be sort of dropping out, falling back, refusing to compete, of course that affects the culture. It makes it very hard to have equality when one group is refusing to race.
Okay, so where did these young men come from? Why have they become so prominent in the last few years, and what happens to them in the future?
Well, the trend toward women overtaking men in educational institutions in developed democracies is still pretty new. We moved very quickly from women being behind, in large part because they were held back by all men's schools and a sense that women were going to just marry and leave the workforce in the 1950s and 60s. They went from being quite behind and needing help to catch up to then surpassing men, in large part, I think, because the whole educational system is really set up to favor girls and women in their brain development. Boys just need a little extra time to mature in the ability to sit down at a desk and learn. And if you start kids off at 5, 6 years old and expect them all to do the same, the girls are naturally going to pull ahead. The boys are going to feel left behind. And as that exacerbates over time, particularly when you have fewer and fewer male teachers and more female teachers who don't really connect with that kind of young boy energy and what you might need to do to teach them, boys are leaning back further and further. So this is a pretty new phenomena that we're seeing in our educational institutions and in our politics.
Rachel, education seems to play a prominent role in this discussion. We've seen about, 60% of college attendees being women for a while now. Is there a danger that education becomes stereotyped as largely a female thing?
Of course, there's a danger. I mean, already young boys see most of their teachers as female. Very few men go into the teaching professions now. And so the idea that the whole educational sphere might be feminine is likely to grow. Add that to the idea that men might be telling them, you shouldn't need to jump through hoops set by women. And if you have mostly women teachers, that makes it a very mixed message for young boys. And they're starting to hear this from the manosphere at quite young ages, 10, 11, 12. And so the likelihood that they don't really respect these female teachers grows. So you're really just setting up a lot of social friction that ultimately will hurt boys in the job market, where you do tend to need college degrees and so on, but will also just hurt society because we need men in the world. They're half the population. We need them to play a role of equality. And if what we have is a bifurcation where men are either at the nosebleed top, like an Elon Musk, or they're quite low in the social hierarchy, that's setting up a recipe for men to be jealous of other men and men to be frustrated with women. And young men who are frustrated and jobless, that is a recipe for social violence and that sort of thing. So this is a problem for all of us to tackle. It's not just a male problem.
So how do we help these men? Do they think they need help?
I'm not talking to them. That's not my role as a researcher of societies, but certainly we need to be working with people who are talking to them, and there's starting to be some movements to do so. I think it's hard because groups that work with men either fall into the kind of men's rights category where they're really bolstering this sense of grievance and anger, or they're trying to do work with men in a more pro-social way, and they're running up against feminist groups that say, hey, wait, we haven't finished the revolution for women. There are still more men at the top. Why are you diverting resources? And I think it's just really important that we as a society open up and realize that we're all in this boat together. You can't help women unless you're also helping the men who will be within the same society as them, and make room for these efforts to build a more pro-social masculinity that's still masculine, that appeals to those men and boys who want to play those more traditional roles and values.
Finally, Rachel, leaving aside all the current young men and the issues they might be having, how do we stop this becoming more of a problem for future generations?
Well, I think one thing that would be very good is to bring back groups that are just for men and boys, led in a more pro-social way. We used to have lots of those kinds of things, Boy Scouts and other groups that were only for men, and actually the problem was a dearth of groups for women. Now, if you go to any elementary school, you'll see all sorts of groups that are either explicitly for women, kind of strong girl groups, STEM for girls, that kind of thing, or they're not explicitly for women, but they overtly attract many more women, like choir and other activities. And so there just aren't that many places where boys are coming together, but then with a role model who is in real life, not just on the internet, and is pro-social and pro-women as well as men. Those spaces that help boys learn to be men have really disappeared in modern life. And men need them, boys need them, and they need them to be guided in a certain direction. Otherwise, they're learning how to be boys and men from Andrew Tate and really pretty nasty influences that they find on the internet when they're looking for how to build muscle or how to date or other questions they're searching for.
Rachel Kleinfeld, thank you so much for joining us on the Fireside Chat.
Thank you.